Somewhere off the Georgia coast, a nuclear bomb has been sitting on the ocean floor since 1958, and nobody's managed to get it back. That's just one thread running through Chapter 2, B-17S, Bayonets and Broken Arrows, where a single day in Savannah collapses centuries of conflict into one long layered reel, from a Haitian prince storming British redoubts in 1779 to a Cold War bomber breaking apart over Tybee Island. When your grandfather flew the same jet that dropped that bomb, the museum glass between past and present gets very thin, very fast. Delirium is a relentless creditor, and after my encounter with a biblical plague of frogs the previous evening, it came to collect. Somewhere around 3 a.m., I concluded that sleep was a concept invented by mattress companies to move product. My day was supposed to have launched with a serene morning walk on a postcard-perfect beach, a glorious first step on my grand coastal expedition to wash away the memory of the amphibious home invasion. But the universe, or perhaps just my own traitorous neurochemistry, had staged a coup. I stared at the ceiling for nearly 5 hours, not wrestling with the world's great mysteries or even what to have for dinner, just awake. My consciousness playing the role of a sentry who had forgotten how to stand down. When the alarm finally chirped, its cheerful tone felt less like an invitation and more like a taunt from a sadistic robot. So I surrendered unconditionally and slept for 3 hours, officially beginning my day just before 10 a.m. My rescheduled grand excursion commenced not with sand between my toes, but with a visit to the mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Pula. It is a jarring pivot, going from the self-inflicted misery of a sleepless night to a place dedicated to genuine large-scale sacrifice. 1 minute you are cursing a lumpy pillow, and the next you are contemplating the fact that this single air armada suffered nearly half of all U.S. Army Air Force casualties in Europe. It is an effective, if unintentional, way to put your own trivial discomforts in their place. The numbers are staggering. Over 26,000 men were killed in action, and just as many became prisoners of war, essentially populating a small metropolis of ghosts. Loitering is a crime usually associated with delinquent youths and people waiting for a bus that never comes. But the mighty 8th transformed the act of hanging around into a strategic art form, parking a veritable city in the clouds directly over enemy territory. At its height, this organization could launch 2,000 four-engine bombers and 1,000 fighters in a single mission. A fleet of man-made thunder that rewrote the sky over Europe. I wandered into a room of exhibits including hand-painted leather flight jackets, where eagles, pin-up art and squadron mascots glare from over 80 pieces of cracked brown hide. Each one is a portable resume in pigment. You can see the war's geography mapped in bombs and flak bursts stitched across a back panel, or notice the paint rubbed smooth where a parachute harness once crossed a shoulder. They make the past feel close enough to scuff your sleeve, a history less read than worn. The museum's centerpiece is a B-17 flying fortress, the city of Savannah, displayed indoors with the reverence usually reserved for a holy relic. This is not some forgotten hulk, but a work in progress. A team of volunteers is painstakingly restoring it to its 1945 combat configuration. Each rivet and wire a small act of devotion, proving that some men will go to great lengths to avoid yard work. Outside, a B-47 Stratojet stands guard like a bouncer at a club for retired aluminum. It is a model of the aircraft involved in the notorious 1958 mid-air collision over nearby Tybee Island, an incident that resulted in a lost, and still unrecovered, nuclear bomb. The plane on display is the aeronautical equivalent of a stunt double attending a memorial for the actor it once resembled. It is this abstract nature of the air war that drove the museum's founder, Major General Lewis E. Lyle, a B-17 pilot who flew 86 missions. He recognized that unlike ground combat, There are no fields or scarred beaches to mark the sites of courage and loss in the sky. All you have are the stories, the machines, and the men. Looking at the fading photographs of these pilots, you realize they were asked to do the impossible: fly into a sky filled with flak and enemy fighters, navigate by the stars and a prayer, drop their payload and somehow return. They were farm boys, mechanics, adventurers, and volunteers. And that last part, in an age of compulsory military service, somehow feels like the most astonishing detail of them all. "You were just babies in the war like the ones upstairs." Kurt Vonnegut, Slaughterhouse-5. Forged in Savannah, remembering the mighty 8th Airmen. Those babies had an address, at least at the beginning. The 8th Air Force was activated in Savannah in January 1942. Its staff assembled on Bull Street before the outfit crossed the Atlantic to wage a daylight bombing campaign against Germany's industrial core. Its emblem, conceived by a local major named Ed Winter, is a winged number 8, a logo fit for a luxury airline that only flies through enemy territory, which, as it turned out, is roughly what it was. From those modest Savannah offices, the 8th would swell into the largest air armada in history, at its peak comprising over 200,000 personnel, sending fleets of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators to poke at the Reich's factory floors in broad daylight. You might assume that sending unescorted bombers deep into hostile airspace was part of some master plan. The early results suggest it was less a plan and more a catastrophic miscalculation. Raids on targets like the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt produced such horrific losses that the strategy was effectively shelved. The air war became a guarded marathon instead of a risky sprint. Deep penetrations halted until the P-51 Mustang could provide escort cover all the way into Germany. Before those long-range fighters arrived, roughly 3 out of 4 airmen didn't finish their 25 mission tours. The ones who did were quietly admitted to the Lucky Bastard Club, a title whose brutal honesty far outweighed its comfort. The 100th Bomb Group, subject of the recent series Masters of the Air, earned its nickname the Bloody 100th for a particularly grim run of losses in 1943. The perils weren't all man-made. Inside unpressurized cabins, temperatures could plunge to 60 below. Frostbite was a constant companion, and oxygen failure could take a man from alert to groggy to gone in minutes. Looking at the masks and hoses on display, you see the hardware, stubborn and indifferent to the flesh it was designed to sustain. On D-Day, these crews flew thousands of sorties, hitting rail junctions and gun positions to clear the skies over the beaches. Their contribution was immense, and the price had already been paid many times over. Then there is the matter of the headquarters, an arrangement so peculiar it could only have been approved by the British. The nerve center of this aerial armada, codenamed Pine Tree, was established in Wycombe Abbey, a girls' boarding school in Buckinghamshire. While young women were practicing piano and declining Latin nouns, men like Ira Eaker and Jimmy Doolittle, who took command in January 1944 and overhauled escort tactics for the better, were moving pins across a map, deciding the fate of steel, fire, and American lives. The air war, being directed from a building designed for lessons in etiquette, carries a logic all its own, as if Allied command had calmly announced, "The strategic bombing campaign will be conducted from the West Library. Do mind the carpet." Despite the almost storybook finality of 1945, the 8th Air Force refused to end. It persists today at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, tasked with America's long-range bomber forces and strategic deterrence. Some outfits are just too stubborn for a clean finish, though the path from Bull Street to Barksdale ran through several reinventions. Canvas and command, from nose art to global reach. Losing a private war with your own circadian rhythm, as I had just done, makes the world feel like it is being broadcast from a slightly faulty transmitter. The halls of the 8th Air Force Museum, still smelling of wax and ghosts, presented a universe of immense sacrifice where young men defied arithmetic to survive 25 missions. They also, it should be noted, spent a considerable amount of time painting scantily clad women on multi-million-dollar government property. The museum's collection of hand-painted A2 leather flight jackets, each one a personal billboard worn at 25,000 feet, preserves the evidence. The painting was a way for a crew to give their government-issue bomber a soul, to bond with the machine that might, with any luck, bring them home. An unofficial art movement conducted in freezing temperatures, its curators were local commanders who had to double as arbiters of good taste. The official policy on nose art and jacket illustrations was never clearly written down, leaving some poor officer to squint at a pin-up and diplomatically suggest the artist add clothes. Some painters, like Staff Sergeant Ernest Lovato of the 100th Bomb Group, became celebrated in-house artists, their work a flash of defiant personality against the backdrop of total war. Seeing the famed square D tail marking of the 100th, a unit whose history reads like a signed confession, you get a sense of this fierce tribal identity. That simple geometric symbol has outlived the B-17S it once adorned. It is carried forward today by the 100th Air Refueling Wing, which means a logo forged in the skies over Germany now signifies the aerial equivalent of a floating gas station. This is not a complaint, it is an observation on how military heraldry, like a noble family line, sometimes finds its descendants in decidedly less dramatic, though still essential, professions. The shift tracks something larger. During the war, the U.S. Army Air Forces was a sprawling, almost feudal enterprise, organized around theaters of war and massive numbered air forces that ran everything within their geographic domain. The 8th, born on Bull Street, fought its war over Europe. Today, the organization chart has been put on a diet. The independent U.S. Air Force is arranged by function into major commands, or MAGCOMs. The strategic bombers that once belonged to the theater-focused 8th now answer to the Air Force Global Strike Command. A name so bluntly functional it sounds like it was invented by a committee that communicates exclusively through spreadsheets, the old deep, dense layers of command, air divisions, combat wings, groups, have been flattened into a leaner model where the wing is the basic, all-in-one unit. It is a change from a structure built for a world-spanning brawl to one designed for precise, global reach. The old 8th Air Force was a blunt instrument of staggering size, directing bombers, fighters, and everything in between to win a war in one theater. The modern structure is built for a different kind of world, one of faster decisions and fewer bodies. Was something essential lost when the sprawling, idiosyncratic commands of World War II were traded for the crisp efficiency of a modern org chart? Possibly, though the answer may depend less on the chart itself than on the people who inhabited it, the ones whose instincts and stubbornness bent rigid doctrine until it actually worked. Aviation's architect, Doolittle's flight and fight. A commander's influence can often feel as abstract as a line on a map, but the museum gives you Jimmy Doolittle, the kind of man whose instincts and stubbornness bent rigid doctrine until it actually worked. He seemed to carry a slide rule in one pocket and a box of dynamite in the other, a pilot engineer, a figure who not only had the nerve to fly planes in ways that invited mechanical failure, but also held the degree to understand exactly why it was a bad idea. In 1925, he earned the country's first doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, a qualification that grounded his daredevilry in something approaching disciplined science, though the discipline was hard to see from the outside. He didn't just loop a plane. In 1927, he performed the first outside loop, a maneuver previously filed under things that make wings fall off. Before the war, Doolittle dedicated himself to making aviation less of a gamble and more of a science. He flew from one coast of America to the other in 1922 with only a single stop, a feat that earned him a Distinguished Flying Cross. He then moved on to a problem that seems more philosophical than technical: how to fly without seeing. In 1929, he climbed into a cockpit, had the windows completely blacked out, and proceeded to take off, fly a circuit, and land using only his instruments. With the help of new gyroscopic instruments and the Colesman altimeter, he proved that a pilot's eyes were, in a pinch, optional. That innovation made all-weather airline operations possible, transforming flying from a fair-weather hobby into a reliable mode of transport. He worked for Shell Oil too, where he pushed for the development of 100-octane gasoline, a high-test fuel that would give Allied engines a measurable edge in speed and climb when it mattered most. Then came Pearl Harbor, and Doolittle's most famous contribution was conceived in secrecy and executed against impossible odds. On April 18, 1942, he led a flight of 16 B-25 bombers off the deck of the USS Hornet to strike Japan. The plan was already a long shot, but when a Japanese picket boat spotted the task force, it became even dicier. They were forced to launch from 650 nautical miles out, a distance that stretched their fuel to the breaking point. The mission went forward with some inspired, almost comical improvisations. The top-secret Norden bomb sight, a marvel of engineering, was yanked out and replaced with a simple device invented by a captain and named the Mark Twain sight, presumably because it relied more on homespun wit than on classified gears. For defense, some planes sported fake tail guns fashioned from painted broomsticks, a bit of stagecraft intended to scare off attackers. The bombers were not expected to return to the carriers. Their crews were on a one-way trip, hoping to land in friendly territory in China. Many did not. Doolittle himself thought he might face a court-martial for losing all 16 aircraft. He had delivered a morale shock to Tokyo and forced the Japanese military to pull fighter units home for defense. But leading a mission where you lose all your planes rarely looks good on a performance review. Instead, he was met with the Medal of Honor and a promotion from Lieutenant Colonel straight to Brigadier General. A career jump so abrupt it must have given him vertigo. His next job, taking command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, was where his strategic mind truly shone. Until then, American doctrine kept escort fighters glued to the bombers, a sort of aerial bodyguard duty that left them defensive and reactive. Bomber crews were being lost at a rate that made a 25-mission tour a statistical miracle. Doolittle simply changed the rules. He sent the fighters, particularly the new long-range P-51 Mustangs, out ahead of the bombers with one order: go find the enemy and kill him. The strategy flipped a campaign. By hunting the Luftwaffe proactively, the 8th broke the back of German air power and secured the skies for the invasion of Europe. The man who had once accepted near certain loss of every aircraft on a single mission now commanded the force that would make the skies survivable for the crews flying through them. The Raiders' silver goblets, kept in a museum where surviving members would gather annually to toast their fallen and turn over the cups of the dead, are one kind of memorial to what Doolittle set in motion. But the more consequential legacy may be what happened over Germany after he arrived. Bomber crews, for the first time, had a fighting chance of making it to 25. Chosen Sky, the Belle's crafted legend. From Doolittle's fighter doctrine, the museum's path looped me back to the hardware. Under the vaulted ceiling of the restoration hangar sat a B-17 Flying Fortress, the city of Savannah, stripped to aluminum ribs and wiring, undergoing a painstaking resurrection. It is a powerful sight, But when you think of the B-17, you don't think of this one. You think of the Memphis Belle. And the story of the Belle is a masterclass in how history gets written by the marketing department. The legend, as most of us know it, is that the Memphis Belle was the first B-17 to survive 25 missions over Europe, a statistical miracle at a time when survival was a temporary condition. The truth is a bit more complicated, proving that even in a world war, being first isn't as important as having good timing and a great publicist. The actual first plane to hit the 25 mission mark was a B-17 from the 303rd Bomb Group named Hell's Angels, which beat the Belle to the punch in May 1943. Another plane, Delta Rebel No. 2, may have done it even earlier. But these planes apparently weren't destined for stardom. They had the credentials but lacked the cinematic sparkle. The Belle got the glory because it was chosen. The decision came from the top, likely from General Hap Arnold himself, who saw a golden opportunity. He needed a symbol to sell the brutal daylight bombing campaign to the American public, and Captain Robert K. Morgan's crew fit the bill. Their fame was crafted with the precision of a Norden bomb sight, hinging on one key detail. They were the first 25 mission crew to complete their tour and fly home to the States. The cameras, naturally, were waiting. Which leads us to Hollywood's accidental entry into the story. The famed director William Wyler was already in England filming a documentary about the air war. His original subject, a B-17 named Invasion II, met a horribly predictable fate over Bremen. Losing your star is an inconvenience in Hollywood. When it happens at 25,000 feet over Germany, you have a more significant problem. Needing a new hero, and more importantly, a hero likely to survive long enough for a third act, Wyler turned his cameras to the Memphis Belle, which was tantalizingly close to finishing its tour. With a plane, a photogenic crew, and a trove of combat footage already in the can, the War Department had a ready-made narrative package. The Belle and her crew were promptly sent on a 26th mission, a massive war bond tour across America in the summer of 1943. It was a perfectly timed roadshow designed to boost morale and keep the war loan drives in the headlines. Crowds gathered not for autographs in a souvenir program, but on the back of Series E bond receipts. This was arguably the most successful branding campaign of the war, cementing the Belle's place in public memory while Hell's Angels faded into a footnote for trivia night. After its tour of duty and subsequent celebrity tour, the original Memphis Belle eventually found its way to a permanent home. It is now on display at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, following a decade-long restoration of its own that was unveiled in 2018. The bomber here in Pooler, the city of Savannah, serves a different but equally vital purpose, anchoring an exhibit on the men who flew these unpressurized, unheated machines into hostile skies at altitudes where exposed skin froze on contact. Standing before it, I could see the distinction clearly. One plane the manufactured icon, the other a hands-on lesson in the anonymous grit it took to become one. The Belle went home to bond rallies. Planes like the city of Savannah just went back up. And the city that lent this bomber its name had, by 1942, thrown considerably more than a single aircraft into the war. Runways to Rivets, Savannah's WWII machine at work. Gripped by the winged 8 still buzzing in my head, I went looking for the rest of Savannah's war story. The trail led straight from Pooler's sober hangars to the airfield that gave the city its launch pad. Before uniforms took the keys in 1940, Savannah's municipal airport had been a tidy 1929 affair. War renamed it Hunter Field in honor of Frank O'Driscoll Hunter, a World War I ace with a surname that sounded like a recruiting poster. Here, crews learned to fly bombers that behaved like temperamental racehorses, including the B-26 Marauder. The place also ran on a different kind of horsepower, the 762nd Women's Army Auxiliary Corps Post Headquarters Company. They grew to about 300 women, and they kept the machine moving. Operations, messages, supply, the 1,000 invisible ligaments that make a base stand upright. Hunter became a processing hub too, the normal port of debarkation for aircraft redeploying over the southern and mid-Atlantic routes. After Portugal allowed Allied use of Lajes Field in the Azores in 1943, lines on the map multiplied, arrows marching across the Atlantic like a training cadence. Down at the river, Savannah didn't whisper about the war. It howled. The Southeastern Shipbuilding Corporation rose for the fight and turned the waterfront into an industrial engine. Liberty ships, 441 feet of urgently needed cargo, slid off the ways so often the river must have checked its watch. At the peak, more than 15,000 men and women labored in 3 shifts. Heat from the welders' torches met the marsh breeze, steel rang, paint stung the nose. By 1945, the yard had cut the time to build a Liberty ship from 244 days to 44, a kind of civic sorcery fueled by lunch pails and overtime. Savannah launched 88 of them in all, hulls that kept the Atlantic supplied and the math of survival working in our favor. The production boards of that era had the tone of a stern uncle. If the assembly schedule exceeds the hourly laydown rate, then emergency shifts are to be activated, it would have barked. Relax, someone always says, it won't take that long. We are now in an emergency, the board would reply, not even looking up from its stopwatch. West of town, Camp Stewart, today's Fort Stewart, trained the hands that aimed at the sky. Anti-aircraft artillery crews learned to track and fire until the calculations lived in their bones. In the run-up to D-Day, the camp swelled to over 55,000 soldiers, a temporary city of grit, wool, and instruction. When those troops shipped out, the roles shifted. Camp Stewart, along with Fort Oglethorpe south of Chattanooga, housed German and Italian prisoners of war. They worked on the bases and out on local farms, turning the daily gears that keep a place fed and functioning. It's a quiet, complicated footnote, labor exchanged for custody, folded into the larger arithmetic of a global crisis. I stood in the museum lot a while longer, the city of Savannah's aluminum ribs still ghosting my vision, and considered how the town didn't just birth an air force. It built ships by the acre, trained gunners by the division, and ran an airfield like a railroad depot for the sky. To give a war its wings, you first need somewhere to put the ladders, the rivets, and the courage. Savannah, admiralty of logistics. But all those Liberty ships had to sail somewhere, and the Atlantic they sailed into was not empty. By early 1942, while the shipyard hammered and Hunter Field hummed, the war was already circling back toward the Georgia coast. City lights, Georgia nights, U-123's raids and rebirth. The museum panels made a simple, unnerving point. While Savannah was building bombers and cranking out cargo ships, German U-boats were prowling just offshore. The U-123, a Type 9B commanded by Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hardigan, turned the Atlantic off Georgia into a live-fire warning label in early 1942. The Germans called it the Second Happy Time, which is the kind of cheerful branding that makes you check the exits. America's coastal defenses were thin, few convoys, loose procedures, and city lights that obligingly outlined tankers like a stage manager handing cues to the villain. The government scrambled, civilian air patrols, blackouts, an order to clear out the Jekyll Island Club, where the wealthy had to swap croquet for caution. Then came April 8, 1942. Near the St. Simon's Seabuoy, Hardigan sighted tankers backlit by the coast and put a G-7E torpedo into the SS Oklahoma, a 9,200-ton tanker. That same morning he hit the Esso Baton Rouge, carrying nearly 90,000 barrels of oil and zigzagging north like a nervous crab. The second attack landed at about 8:44 a.m., roughly 15 miles northeast of St. Simons. The blasts shattered windows in Brunswick. Survivors went to the St. Simons Coast Guard station, shaken and alive. The first count from those two tankers was 22 dead. 5 men lay in Brunswick's Palmetto Cemetery without names for decades until 1998 gave them back. The dates read like a ship's log, but the details stick: who got picked up, who didn't, who stayed anonymous for a lifetime. Hardigan returned the next day and sank the SS Esparta about 14 miles south of Brunswick. Local memory still talks about pre-dawn thunder and the sad, strange debris of a working ship. Oranges bobbing up and foil-wrapped turkeys sliding onto the beach like a holiday that refused to wait for a calendar. The kind of sight that makes you both hungry and queasy, which is how history often tastes. U-123 kept ranging south. On April 11th, it torpedoed the tanker Gulf America off Jacksonville. Resort lights outlined the scene so brightly that crowds watched from the boardwalk as if war were a theater piece and the concessions would reopen at intermission. It wasn't courage or cowardice. It was incandescent ignorance, cured within weeks by blackouts and a belated convoy system. Behind those headlines sits the broader map. U-123 had already joined Operation Drumbeat, the German push down the east coast. On its first patrol, it sank 9 ships, a tally that reads like a grim set of coordinates. I traced them with a finger across the exhibit's map. A ridiculous act of control, as if I could pin the ocean to a corkboard and talk it into better manners. I want dates, places, and voices because that makes order out of noise. Lyle's idea for this museum, preserving a fight with no battlefields, makes sense in that stubborn way. With air and sea, you need anchors. You pin meaning to a jacket, a shard of plexiglass, the name on a grave. Even the submarine's afterlife refused to stay tidy. By mid-1944, the U-boat war had turned. U-123 was decommissioned in Lorient, then scuttled by her crew in August as Allied forces closed in. The French raised her, rebuilt her, and recommissioned her in 1947 as Blazon Q-165. A frontline U-boat handed a second career under a different flag. She served until 1959. Archivists love a clean ending. The sea prefers the sequel. And for the footnote collectors among us, the U-123 that laid mines in World War I was a different boat entirely. Surrendered in 1918 and scuttled in 1921. Same number, different ghost. I stood between the restored B-17 and a wall of painted jackets, thinking about the windows that broke in Brunswick and the turkeys that came ashore. The waterfront where Savannah forged 88 Liberty ships, and the camp where gunners trained share a timeline with Hardigan's wake. The noise of riveters and the quiet hush of a blackout are partners in the same uneasy duet. Loose lips sink ships, the War Advertising Council warned in 1942. They meant careless talk. They could just as easily have meant the shore lights that lit up targets for a periscope. The home front wasn't behind anything. It was the front. And by 1942, Savannah's name was already out on that contested ocean, painted on the hull of a light cruiser sailing toward a war of its own. Scarred steel, steady course, Savannah's road to Yalta. The prior article's last line had pointed toward a light cruiser carrying Savannah's name into a war of its own. I took the hint. The city had loaned itself to a bomber under restoration lights inside the museum, and now it demanded equal billing at sea. My plan was simple and impossibly grand. Follow the name from sky to water and pretend I was steward of an entire fleet because I had a day pass and a curious brain. USS Savannah, CL-42, arrived draped in Georgia connections. Before the Pacific or the big Mediterranean show, she prowled the Atlantic on neutrality patrols, which is like standing between two feuding neighbors while insisting you're just out for a walk. In November 1941, she came nose to nose with the German blockade runner Odenwald and helped put a stop to its sneaking. A few months later, she was throwing weight for Operation Torch in North Africa, hurling 6-inch shells in support. The ship's defining day came at Salerno, September 11, 1943, when Germany introduced a new kind of rudeness. A radio-controlled Fritz X glide bomb fell from the sky with the confidence of a doctoral thesis and the manners of a brick. It punched through the armored roof of turret number 3, bored through 3 decks, and erupted in the lower ammunition handling room. Nearly 200 sailors were lost in that blast. The crew kept her alive. They fought the fires, stopped the flooding, and made a broken cruiser behave. She was towed to Malta for temporary repairs, then limped across an ocean to the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard for 8 months of steel therapy and modernization. Fixing her instead of scrapping her wasn't sentiment, it was math. A veteran warship could be returned to the fight far faster than a new one could be conjured from blueprints and optimism. Wartime logistics is a cold accountant with grease under the nails. When she returned, the Navy handed her a job that measured trust in tons. Savannah joined the flotilla that escorted President Franklin D. Roosevelt aboard the USS Quincy to the Yalta Conference in February 1945. A wartime president on a warship going to a diplomatic summit that had never been attempted at sea? The image lands like a final chord, a battered cruiser, repaired and recommissioned, guarding a fragile, moving conference room where the map of the post-war world was being penciled in. The people on deck that day knew how loud history gets. The name didn't go quiet when the big guns retired. It surfaced again in 2022 on a modern littoral combat ship, all angles and aluminum, a blade built for the crowded edges of the world's seas. The old cruiser had traded armor belts for software, but the city kept its berth in the Navy's mouth. The word Savannah still went to sea. A modest poem for steel and stubbornness. O Savannah of decks and dent, of smoke that rose, of steel that bent, you took a blow, then made it neat. 8 months of fix returned to fleet. You guarded Yalta's careful talk. You kept your station, took your walk. And now your name, still brine and grit, rides modern seas that never sit. I walked back toward the museum with sea names still ringing in my ears and found myself standing in front of a different kind of aircraft than the B-17 inside. The aircraft parked on the grounds outside was sleeker, stranger, and tied to a story much closer to home. B-47, Sentinel, Tybee Shadows, Grandfather, and the 707. Outside was a B-47 Stratojet, perched on its peculiar stilts like something that had landed once and decided the ground was beneath it. Sleeker than the B-17 inside, longer in the nose, and swept back with the aggressive posture of a decade that believed speed could outrun its own consequences. This particular airplane is baked into the local lore of Savannah. It marks the 1958 Tybee Island Broken Arrow incident, a mid-air collision that concluded with a thermonuclear bomb being misplaced in the coastal waters off the Georgia shore. The event was followed by what I imagine was a great deal of strained silence over Sunday dinners for years to come. In the early Cold War, the Stratojet was everywhere. Here, it's forever tethered to the moment the era's abstract anxieties showed up at the beach, tracking sand into the house. Back in its prime, the B-47 was America's first modern jet bomber and the workhorse of the Strategic Air Command. From 1951, it was the primary vehicle for hauling the nuclear mail before bigger, brawnier aircraft shouldered the responsibility. Entire wings of these things rotated to forward bases on reflex deployments, which was sold as the world's most serious version of corporate travel. complete with terrible food but considerably higher stakes than missing a quarterly target. It accomplished all this with 6 jet engines dangling in pods under its wings, a design that Boeing perfected and then passed down to its civilian jetliners like a secret family recipe. Those wings, swept back at a sharp 35 degrees, were so thin they looked like the edges of a ripsaw. They were flexible, they breathed, and they left absolutely no room for something as practical as landing gear. This engineering compromise resulted in a bicycle setup, with the main wheels in a line under the fuselage and tiny outriggers on the wingtips, like a giant metal bird on training wheels. Parked on the ramp, it seemed less like an airplane and more like a high-wire act that had found its perfect point of balance. The design choice had other consequences. With no room in the wings, the ejection seat rails for the pilot and co-pilot had to go somewhere creative, which led to one of aviation's most psychologically unsound features, downward-firing ejection seats. What level of Zen-like faith is required to sit on a chair that has promised to personally punch you through the floor in an emergency? According to 1950s test reports, the answer was plenty, preferably with a lot of altitude. If the B-47 had any uncouth habits, it was a little dance step called the Dutch roll, a tail-wagging, wing-rocking wobble common in jets with flexible, swept-wing designs. It looked, I assume, like a fish trying to walk. Boeing's fix was the yaw damper, an automatic system that acted as the plane's designated hall monitor, keeping its nose pointed forward. Like the podded engines and swept wings, this technology migrated directly into the Boeing 707 and all its descendants. The spookier cousin, the RB-47, was the reconnaissance model, designed to tiptoe along the edges of the Soviet Union, sipping signals and testing the other side's patience. On July 1, 1960, one of these went down over the Barents Sea. 4 crewmen were killed and 2 were captured. Standing in the museum's quiet, a date like that feels less like a historical footnote and more like a bell being struck. I have a bit of a stake in this story, or at least some relevant DNA. My grandfather was a bombardier on one of these planes during the Korean War period. He aimed bombs for a living. My great expedition for the day involved aiming myself toward a museum placard and then finding a decent patch of shade. Standing under the thin, hot metal that taught the world how to fly fast, I felt a faint tug on a family thread. It was a strange connection in a place devoted to a war fought in the air, a conflict that left behind no battlefield to walk, only stories and machines. Inside the museum, the propellers and rivets of the city of Savannah sit in carefully placed spotlights. Outside, this swept-wing comet leans into a wind that isn't there. A ship once guarded a president across a hostile ocean. A jet once cruised over continents with steady, world-ending patience. The plane's silver skin flashed in the sun, and I stood in the sticky heat, listening to the drone of the highway, thinking of a row of painted jackets, a grandfather's logbook, and the strange, accidental grace of a doomsday bus. And then, of course, there was the bomb. The one still out there, somewhere in the murky water off Tybee, the reason this plane sits on its stilts in the first place. Broken arrow in brackish water, Savannah's secret stays submerged. Broken arrow is the official term for this sort of thing, which sounds polite, like a Boy Scout mishap, and not at all like we dropped a Mark 15 off Tybee and never saw it again. The local connection is tight. Hunter Air Force Base was home to the 308th Bombardment Wing and the B-47 at the center of it all. On February 5, 1958, Major Howard Richardson's Stratojet collided with an F-86 during a mock combat exercise near Savannah. The bomber carried one Mark 15, roughly 7,600 pounds of Cold War optimism. With a damaged wing and a heavy problem, Richardson asked to ditch the weapon rather than risk dragging its conventional explosives across Hunter's runway. Permission granted. He aimed for the shallow cushion of Wassaw Sound. The crew watched a big, gulping bubble rise, then nothing. Richardson brought the B-47 home in one piece to the same base that had launched it. Grey water swallowed a secret, exhaled only ripples. The search that followed was enormous and muddy. Navy divers and Air Force crews spent more than 2 months probing the sea floor, turning up silt and confusion but no bomb. The coast here is soft as cake batter. Anything you set down sinks until it meets the core of the earth. Eventually, the Air Force declared the thing irretrievably lost, which is government for, "We have no idea, please stop asking where you put it last." Here's the part that makes locals roll their eyes less. The government insists the Mark 15 on that flight didn't carry its plutonium pit, the nuclear core that would have made the worst sort of fireworks. No chain reaction sat inside that metal shell. What it did have, and still has down there somewhere, was about 400 pounds of conventional explosives, the kind used to squeeze a core that wasn't present. Dangerous on land if you detonate it. Content to nap under sand if you leave it alone. The official line has stayed steady. It's safe where it is. When I first moved here in 2004, there was a buzz on the docks and in the diners that the Tybee bomb had finally been found. Men with coffee and certainty pointed at the water as if the Atlantic were a transparent jewelry case. A retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, Derek Duke, had logged some lively Geiger readings offshore the year before, and the story sprinted. The Air Force came back for the first real look in decades. On June 17, 2005, they announced the verdict. No bomb at the surveyed spots, and those jittery readings matched monazite, thorium-flavored sand that lives in this coast like salt in a biscuit. The counts were scattered and natural, not the focused signature you'd expect if you were hovering over a wayward warhead. The policy needle moved to stewardship, which is bureaucrat for please do not dig up the sea in hopes of a souvenir. Disturbing sediment or bumping buried explosives would be, as the scientists say, suboptimal. Standing outside the museum now, the replica glints on its stilts. It's a local myth in aluminum, the jet that once carried fear, influence, and, on a bad day, loose ordnance. The story isn't a ghost tale so much as a ledger entry from the long book of the Cold War, when Savannah's airfield trained crews and pretended the unthinkable was just another checklist item. Hunter's runways are still there. Tybee still throws her tide over Wassaw Sound twice a day, as if the ocean itself were filing paperwork. A mid-air collision, a hard choice solved by water, a long, fruitless search, a rumor with a Geiger counter, and finally, a quiet agreement to let silt do what silt does best: keep a secret. The Pentagon, for its part, had a name for each grade of nuclear mishap, and Tybee's was hardly the only entry in the ledger. Broken arrows, bent spears, a field guide to fallout. Wrapped in the afterglow of Tybee's wayward megaton souvenir, I promoted myself to catastrophe sommelier, quartermaster of airborne mistakes, and itinerant archivist of things that should never fall out of airplanes. Then, worst of all, to a pedant about Pentagon vocabulary. That last promotion felt the most scandalous. Back by the B-47's aluminum glare, I reread the Air Force's field guide to disaster, a medieval bestiary of modern calamities where every beast has a tidy name. The term had already come up once at the museum's plaque, broken arrow, covering any accident or loss involving a nuclear weapon that does not risk nuclear war. Our Tybee episode fits here, a clean entry filed under "dropped it on purpose so the base wouldn't blow." The category covers jettisoned weapons, transport contamination, fires, and those unsettling moments when only the conventional explosives go off. It's the club you never want to join, and yet history keeps paying dues. Remarkable incidents test the definition until it hums. In 1966, over Palomares, Spain, a B-52G tangled with a KC-135 tanker mid-air and lost 4 B-28 bombs. 2 hit hard enough that their conventional explosives popped, spraying plutonium over farmland. The cleanup crew scraped, shoveled and shipped about 1,750 tons of contaminated soil and plants to the Savannah River site in South Carolina, like some ghastly gift basket with a Georgia return address. A 4th bomb took an 80-day spar in the Mediterranean before divers hauled it up. 2 years later, near Thule, Greenland, another B-52G wrecked on North Star Bay. All 4 bombs' conventional charges cooked off, and the remedy, Project Crested Ice, was as charming as it sounds: scoop the tainted snow and bag the wreckage. The prize for darkest near miss still goes to 1961 near Goldsboro, North Carolina. A B-52 broke apart and dropped 2 Mark 39s. 1 parachuted down and marched through 5 of 6 arming steps. A humble, low-voltage switch kept North Carolina from becoming a cautionary proverb. The other smashed into wet ground and came apart. The uranium core was never fully recovered and still naps under a legal easement nobody is allowed to disturb. Then there was Damascus, Arkansas in 1980. A dropped socket punctured a Titan II's fuel tank. The silo blew. The W-53 warhead pinwheeled out like a very unwelcome baton before crews found it intact and unspilled. That bang supercharged safety rules and reminded everyone why accident taxonomy exists in the first place. Empty quiver is the chilling cousin, covering the seizure or theft of an intact nuclear weapon. It's deliberate, not accidental. The difference between losing your wallet and being mugged. The 1996 movie Broken Arrow attempted to rename the crime with Hollywood confidence, which is very on-brand for Hollywood and very off-brand for the Joint Staff. Then there is Nuck Flash, the siren in all caps. It covers any detonation or event that could start a nuclear war, including an unauthorized launch or a serious missile warning, the word you never want on the line with your morning coffee. The guards at this gate are systems like dual phenomenology. Satellites must see the hot plume of a launch, and ground radars must confirm a track before anyone commits history's worst send. The whole mechanism is designed to slow the human tendency toward panic buying. On the other hand, Nuck Flash also sounds like a discount camera setting. There are milder storm flags. Bent spear marks significant incidents with nuclear weapons or parts. Serious, but not Broken Arrow or Nuke Flash. The modern favorite is 2007's Minot to Barksdale Safari, when a B-52 ferried 6 live nuclear cruise missiles across the country without anyone noticing the live part until they landed. Dull Sword is smaller stuff, reportable flaws, and hiccups that could impair readiness. The tiny loose screws that keep you from trusting a very large machine. Faded Giant is reserved for nuclear reactor or radiological accidents that don't involve weapons at all. A separate aisle for a different kind of bad day. And Pinnacle sits over the whole filing cabinet like a neon sticky note in the Joint Staff's OPREP 3 reporting system, a priority tag for events of national level interest, hence the goosebump-inducing Pinnacle Nuck Flash. I stood under the B-47's silver wing, the parking lot sun flat on the replica's skin, wind pulling at the museum brochure in my hand. The Pentagon has named chaos with a librarian's grace. We name it well. We store it worse. Paper Carousels, Savannah's unflattering welcome mat. The Pentagon, I reflected, had built itself a tidy filing cabinet for the end of the world. Broken Arrow for the dropped bomb, Empty Quiver for the stolen one, Nuck Flash for the kind of morning no one recovers from. My own arrival in Savannah 2 decades prior felt like it deserved its own flag word. A minor calamity that, while not risking nuclear war, certainly risked my sanity. It began not with a mid-air collision but a parking sticker. Through some Herculean feat of bureaucratic defiance, I had secured a colonel's parking decal, a small symbol of my father's rank that promised a reserved spot at the post commissary. Affixed to the windshield of my tiny Toyota Corolla, a vehicle better suited to a second lieutenant with budgeting problems, it looked less like an emblem of authority and more like a plea for pity. This minor triumph of paperwork over reality would prove to be the last orderly event for some time. My family, having generously agreed to help me relocate, first checked into a hotel near Hunter Army Airfield. We pulled back the sheets on the bed to discover a large, mysterious brown stain in the center. A Rorschach test for all things unhygienic, a Jackson Pollock of poor life choices. We fled that room for another lodging, but the artistic statement had been made. The tone for my new life had been set not in beige or eggshell, but in an unsettling shade of brown. My apartment budget, a princely sum somewhere between $400 and $600, led me to a series of one-bedroom units that made the stained hotel bed look like a presidential suite. I eventually found one teeming with roaches, located in a complex whose parking lot moonlighted as a boneyard for stolen cars. It was during a viewing of one such fine establishment that our rental car was broken into. We were gone for less than 20 minutes. The thief made off with my sister's purse, which contained her passport, a detail that was not entirely convenient, as she and my parents were scheduled to fly back to Italy in 2 days. Our first strategy was to wander the neighborhood, operating on the hopeful theory that the thief only wanted cash and had casually discarded the purse in a nearby bush. This was both pointless and stupid, a plan born of pure desperation. Our search took us past an enormous papier-mâché structure proclaiming itself the Black Holocaust Museum, an architectural and thematic curveball I was ill-prepared to process. When we met the police, the responding officer was a portrait of weary resignation. "Yeah, I probably know who did it," he said with a sigh. "He just wants to get put in jail for a hot meal and a bed." Thankfully, my father had access to a higher power than local law enforcement, the State Department. A single phone call rerouted my family to Washington, D.C., where they visited the Pentagon's passport office. An institution capable of losing a thermonuclear bomb off the coast of Georgia proved surprisingly adept at replacing a tourist's travel document. Within an hour, a new passport was in my sister's hand, and they were on their way. The crisis was averted, and I was mercifully spared a new roommate. Many months later, the passport was found in a drainage ditch.